The dust-laden wind stung Violet, Hayes' tear-stained cheeks, as she sat motionless on her trunk in the wagon yard of Cottonwood Springs, her soul as barren as the surrounding landscape. The year was 1878, and everything she had ever known or loved had been stripped away, leaving her alone in a strange frontier town with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a heart full of grief. Violet pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the September air carrying the first hint of autumn chill across the New Mexico territory. 3 weeks ago, she had been safely ensconced in her family home in St. Louis, preparing for her wedding to a man she thought she knew. Now, that man was gone along with her family's savings, leaving only a hastily scrawled note explaining he'd found a better opportunity out west. Her parents, already struggling to maintain appearances after her father's business failures, had made it clear there was no place for her at home anymore. The shame of a broken engagement was too much for their fragile social standing. So here she sat, 22 years old and utterly alone, having spent the last of her money on the stagecoach fare to this dusty town where a distant cousin supposedly lived. Only to discover upon arrival that said cousin had moved on months ago, leaving no forwarding address. The wagon yard bustled around her, freight wagons coming and going, cowboys calling to one another, and merchants hawking their wares. No one paid any mind to the young woman sitting so still amid the chaos, her once fine traveling dress now wrinkled and dust-covered, her chestnut hair escaping its pins after days of difficult travel. Violet fought back another wave of tears. She wouldn't cry again, couldn't. She needed to think, to plan. The small amount of money remaining in her reticule wouldn't buy more than a night's lodging and perhaps a meal. After that, she didn't want to consider what might come after that. "Miss, are you waitin' on someone?" The deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Violet looked up, squinting into the late afternoon sun that silhouetted the tall figure standing before her. As he shifted, blocking the glare, she could make out his features, a weathered face with kind eyes the color of a summer sky, stubbled jaw, and sun-bleached hair beneath a well-worn cowboy hat. "No," she answered honestly, too exhausted for pretense. "I'm not waiting for anyone." The man nodded slowly, taking in her trunk, her disheveled appearance, and the defeated slump of her shoulders. "Been sittin' here quite a while," he observed, his tone gentle. "Stage pulled out hours ago." "I know." Violet straightened her back, attempting to salvage some dignity. "I'm considering my options." The cowboy shifted his weight, appearing to deliberate with himself before speaking again. "Name's Jackson Wade. I own a small spread about 10 miles west of town." He removed his hat, revealing tousled hair the color of wheat. "Don't mean to pry, but you look like you might be in need of some assistance." Violet hesitated, years of proper upbringing warring with desperate circumstances. "Violet Hayes," she finally replied. "And yes, Mr. Wade, I find myself in rather difficult straits at the moment." Jackson Wade nodded, replacing his hat. "Town's not safe for a lady alone, especially come nightfall." He glanced around the bustling wagon yard, then back at her. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Hayes, if you're willing to hear it." Wariness crept into Violet's expression. She'd already trusted one man too many. Noting her apprehension, Jackson quickly continued, "My sister-in-law passed last winter, left my brother with 3 young children. He's due back from a cattle drive next month, but those children need looking after. I've been managing as best I can, but—" He shrugged, embarrassment coloring his features. "Truth is, Miss Hayes, I'm not much good with little ones. Was hopping to find someone in town willing to come out to the ranch and help until my brother returns." "You're offering me employment?" Violet asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Room and board plus wages," Jackson confirmed. "It's honest work, Miss Hayes, hard sometimes, but honest. The children are good kids, just missing their mama something fierce." Violet studied him, searching for any sign of deception. All she saw was sincerity in those clear blue eyes and perhaps a hint of desperation that mirrored her own. What choice did she have, really? Stay in town until her meager funds ran out, then what? "The children, how old are they?" she asked, trying to imagine what she might be getting herself into. "Emma's 8, John's 6, and little Sarah just turned 4, Jackson replied. "Smart kids, all of them, just need a woman's touch around the place." Violet took a deep breath. She'd helped care for younger cousins over the years, and she'd always had a way with children. It wasn't the future she'd imagined for herself, but it was a lifeline when she most needed one. "I accept your offer, Mr. Wade," she said, rising to her feet and smoothing her skirts. "Though I should warn you, my experience with ranch life is non-existent." A small smile tugged at the corner of Jackson's mouth. "We all had to start somewhere, Miss Hayes." He reached for her trunk. "Wagon's just over yonder. Got some supplies to load, then we'll head out. Should make it to the ranch before dark if we move quick." Violet followed him across the wagon yard, wondering if she'd just made the wisest decision of her life or the most foolhardy. Either way, she had little left to lose. Jackson's wagon was modest but well-maintained, loaded with supplies for the ranch, sacks of flour and sugar, tools, and other necessities. He secured her trunk in the back, then offered his hand to help her onto the seat. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip steady as she climbed up beside him. "Hope you don't mind a bit of a bumpy ride," he said, settling beside her and taking up the reins. "Road gets rough after we leave town." "I've endured worse these past weeks, Mr. Wade," Violet replied, arranging her skirts around her. "A bumpy road seems a small matter in comparison." Jackson gave her a sidelong glance, curiosity evident in his expression, but he didn't pry. Instead, he clicked his tongue, setting the horses in motion. As the wagon pulled away from Cottonwood Springs, Violet felt a curious mixture of apprehension and relief. Behind her lay heartbreak and humiliation. Ahead, uncertainty and hard work. Yet somehow, sitting beside this quiet, straightforward man, she felt the first tentative stirrings of hope she'd experienced in weeks. The journey to the Wade Ranch passed largely in silence, save for the creaking of the wagon wheels and the occasional comment from Jackson about the land they traversed. Violet was grateful for his lack of questions, using the time to gather her thoughts and steel herself for whatever awaited her at journey's end. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the vast landscape in hues of gold and amber, Jackson pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley ahead. "That's home," he said simply, a note of pride in his voice. "Not much to look at, but the land's good. Stream runs year-round, and we've got some of the best grazing in the territory." Violet gazed at the approaching homestead. A modest two-story house formed the centerpiece, flanked by a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. It wasn't grand by any means, but even from a distance, she could see it was well tended. "It looks peaceful," she offered, surprising herself with the sincerity behind the words. Jackson's features relaxed into a genuine smile. "That it is, Miss Hayes, that it is." As the wagon drew closer, 3 small figures burst from the house, racing toward them with excited shouts. Jackson reined in the horses, his smile widening at the children's enthusiasm. Uncle Jack, they called in chorus, reaching the wagon as it came to a stop. "What you bring us?" the boy asked, bouncing on his toes. "Is that candy?" the youngest girl questioned, pointing at the packages in the wagon. The oldest child, clearly Emma, stood slightly back from her siblings, her eyes fixed on Violet with wary curiosity. "Children," Jackson said, his tone gently reprimanding, "where are your manners? We have a guest." He climbed down from the wagon, then came around to help Violet descend. "This is Miss Hayes. She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping look after you until your pa gets home." 3 pairs of eyes, all the same shade of blue, as Jackson studied Violet with undisguised interest. "Are you going to be our new mama?" the youngest asked bluntly. "Sarah," Emma hissed, mortified by her sister's question. Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she knelt down to be at eye level with little Sarah. "No, sweetheart, I'm just here to help take care of you until your father returns. Think of me as a friend." Sarah considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I don't remember Mama much anymore," she confided in a whisper that everyone could hear. Violet's heart constricted. "Well," she said gently, "perhaps you could tell me about her sometime. It's important to remember the people we love." This seemed to satisfy the child, who suddenly smiled, revealing a missing front tooth. "I like your dress," she declared. "It's pretty even with all the dust." Despite everything, Violet found herself laughing. "Thank you, Sarah. That's very kind of you to say." John, apparently deciding Violet passed muster, tugged at her sleeve. "Can you make biscuits? Uncle Jack burns them something awful." Jackson cleared his throat. "That's enough, you 3. Let Miss Hayes catch her breath before you start making demands." He began unloading supplies from the wagon. Emma, show Miss Hayes to the spare room upstairs. John, help me with these packages. Sarah, you go fetch some fresh water for our guest. The children scattered to their assigned tasks, with Emma leading Violet toward the house. The girl maintained a polite but distinct distance, her small shoulders set in a rigid line. Your uncle seems very fond of you all, Violet offered, trying to bridge the gap. Emma glanced back, her expression serious beyond her years. Uncle Jack's the best. He didn't have to come take care of us after Mama died, but he did, left his own place to help Pa. She pushed open the front door. Pa says Uncle Jack never stays in one place long though, says he's got wandering in his blood. Violet absorbed this information as she followed Emma into the house. The interior was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture and modest attempts at hominess, a colorful quilt draped over a chair, pressed wildflowers in a frame on the wall, children's drawings tacked beside the fireplace. This way, Emma directed, leading Violet up a narrow staircase. You'll sleep in here. It was Mama and Pa's room, but Pa sleeps downstairs now, says the room's too big without her. The bedroom was sparsely furnished but comfortable, with an iron bedstead, dresser, washstand, and a small rocking chair by the window. A handmade quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed. It's lovely, Violet said sincerely. Thank you, Emma. The girl lingered in the doorway. Why did you come here? She asked abruptly. Nobody comes out here unless they have to. Taken aback by the direct question, Violet considered how to respond. Sometimes, she said carefully, life takes unexpected turns. I needed somewhere to go and your uncle needed help with you children. It seemed providential. Emma's brow furrowed. What's providential mean? It means when things work out in a way that seems meant to be, Violet explained. Like fate, Emma asked skeptically. Something like that, Violet smiled. Though I prefer to think of it as grace. Emma seemed to ponder this. Uncle Jack said you were sitting all alone in the wagon yard. He said you looked lost. Heat crept into Violet's cheeks again. I suppose I was, in a way. The girl's expression softened slightly. I feel lost sometimes too, since Mama died. She twisted a lock of her blonde hair around her finger. Do you know how to braid hair? Uncle Jack tries, but he's terrible at it. Violet nodded, grateful for the shift in conversation. I do. Would you like me to braid yours sometime? A ghost of a smile flickered across Emma's face. Maybe, she straightened, resuming her role as lady of the house. Supper's at 6. Uncle Jack usually cooks, but he's not very good at it. We mostly eat beans and biscuits. Perhaps I could help with that as well, Violet offered. Emma shrugged, but Violet caught a glimmer of hope in her eyes before the girl turned away. I'll let you get settled, she said formally, heading back downstairs. Left alone, Violet sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. She glanced around the room, a room where a family had once been happy, where a woman had lived and loved and ultimately left behind those who needed her. Now Violet would sleep here, an interloper in their grief. What had she gotten herself into? She knew nothing about ranch life, about caring for grieving children, about surviving in this harsh, beautiful wilderness. Yet as she heard the comforting sounds of the household below, Jackson's deep voice mingling with the children's higher ones, the clatter of supplies being put away, little Sarah's delighted laugh at something, Violet felt a curious sensation stealing over her. It wasn't home, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was shelter in the storm that had become her life. For now, that would have to be enough. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of heat later in the day. Violet had slept surprisingly well, exhaustion overcoming the strangeness of her new surroundings. She rose early, washed quickly with the water in the pitcher, and dressed in her simplest gown, a practical navy blue that would show the least dirt. When she made her way downstairs, she found Jackson already up, attempting to kindle a fire in the cook stove. He looked up at her entrance, surprise flickering across his features. Morning, Miss Hayes. Didn't expect you up so early. I thought I should begin as I mean to go on, Violet replied, moving to take over the fire building. Please allow me. Jackson stepped back, watching as she expertly arranged the kindling and coaxed the flames to life. You've done that before, he observed. Violet smiled slightly. My family's circumstances changed in recent years. I learned many practical skills I never expected to need. She didn't elaborate further, and Jackson didn't press. Children won't be up for another hour, he said instead. They're good kids, but not early risers by nature. That gives me time to prepare a proper breakfast, Violet said, already taking stock of the kitchen's provisions. Do you have eggs? Henhouse out back. Help yourself. Jackson reached for his hat. I need to check on a calf born yesterday. Been worried about the little fella. He paused at the door. Miss Hayes, I want to thank you again for coming. I know it's not what you're used to, but we're grateful to have you here. Before Violet could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She stood for a moment, absorbing the quiet of the house, then set to work. By the time the children stumbled downstairs, tousle-headed and yawning, she had a breakfast of fresh biscuits, eggs, and bacon waiting. Little Sarah's eyes widened at the spread. It smells like when Mama was here, she whispered, climbing onto her chair. John didn't waste time on sentiment, digging in with enthusiasm. This is real good, Miss Hayes. Only Emma held back, watching Violet with that same wary expression from the previous evening. But hunger eventually won out, and soon she too was eating with appreciation, if not the abandoned gusto of her siblings. Jackson returned as they were finishing, the smell of the barn clinging to his clothes. He hesitated in the doorway, taking in the domestic scene before him with an unreadable expression. Come eat, Uncle Jack, Sarah called. Miss Hayes makes biscuits that don't taste like rocks, a smile cracked through his reserve. That right, guess I should try these miracle biscuits then. He washed his hands at the pump by the sink, then joined them at the table. How's the calf? John asked through a mouthful of food. Doing just fine, Jackson replied, helping himself to breakfast. Strong little fellow, he'll make a good addition to the herd. He took a bite of biscuit and paused, looking at Violet with new respect. These are mighty fine, Miss Hayes. Thank you, she replied, pleased despite herself. It's a simple recipe, simple or not, it's the best thing I've eaten in months. He turned to the children. After breakfast, chores as usual, then lessons. All three children groaned, making Violet smile. You have lessons? She asked, intrigued. Uncle Jack makes us do sums and reading every day, John complained. Says our pa would expect it, and he's right, Violet said firmly. Education is important, even perhaps especially out here. Emma eyed her curiously. Do you know about lessons? I do, Violet confirmed. I was fortunate to receive a good education. Another blessing from her family's formerly comfortable circumstances. Jackson looked up from his plate. Perhaps you'd be willing to take over that part too. I do my best, but I'm no school teacher. I'd be happy to, Violet agreed. It would give her a clear role, a way to be useful beyond just cooking and cleaning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as Violet settled into the rhythm of the household. She helped Sarah tidy the bedroom the little girl shared with Emma, listened to John read haltingly from his primer, and attempted to explain fractions to a skeptical Emma. Between lessons, she explored the house, taking inventory of what needed cleaning, mending, or organizing. By late afternoon, she found herself in the kitchen again, trying to decide what to prepare for supper. The pantry was adequately stocked with staples, but limited in variety. Still, she found enough to put together a hearty stew, setting it to simmer while she mixed dough for more biscuits. As she worked, she became aware of being watched. Turning, she found Jackson leaning against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. The children seem to have taken to you, he said. They're wonderful children, Violet replied honestly. You and your brother have done well with them, especially under such difficult circumstances. Jackson entered the kitchen fully, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she was coming to recognize as a sign of discomfort. James, that's my brother, he's the one who's good with kids. Me, I'm better with horses, less complicated. Violet smiled at that. I'm not so sure. Horses can be quite complex creatures. Maybe so, but they don't ask questions I can't answer. He nodded toward the window, where the children could be seen playing in the yard. Emma asked me last night why her mama had to die. What am I supposed to say to that? The pain in his voice touched something in Violet. The truth, I suppose, that sometimes terrible things happen that we can't understand or explain, that it's okay to be sad and angry about it. That's more or less what I told her, Jackson admitted. Don't know if it helped. It probably did, even if she couldn't show it, Violet said gently. Children need honesty, especially about difficult things. Jackson studied her for a long moment. You're good with them, natural-like. I've always enjoyed children's company, Violet said, turning back to her biscuit dough to hide the flush rising to her cheeks. They see the world so clearly without all the complications we adults impose. HM. Jackson seemed about to say more when little Sarah burst into the kitchen. Uncle Jack, there's a snake by the woodpile, she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. What kind of snake? Jackson asked calmly, straightening up. A big one. Sarah spread her arms wide to indicate truly massive proportions. Is it a rattler? Jackson pressed, already reaching for the shotgun kept near the back door. Sarah considered this seriously. It didn't make the shake noise, she decided. But it's still real big. Let's go see then, Jackson said, taking her small hand in his. He glanced back at Violet. Duty calls, Miss Hayes. As they left, Violet found herself smiling. For all his claims of not being good with children, Jackson had a natural ease with his nieces and nephew that belied his words. The affection between them was obvious, as was his dedication to their well-being. The next week fell into a pattern that began to feel almost natural. Violet rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before the household awakened. Mornings were devoted to lessons with the children, afternoons to household tasks and helping with lighter outdoor chores. Evenings were spent around the table or fireplace, with Jackson sometimes reading aloud from one of the few books in the house while Violet mended clothing or taught Emma to sew. For his part, Jackson seemed to relax incrementally in her presence. His initial formality gave way to a more comfortable companionship, though he maintained a respectful distance. Often, he would disappear for hours to tend to ranch business, returning dusty and tired but always taking time to listen to the children's accounts of their day. Violet found herself watching him when he wasn't aware the gentle way he lifted Sarah onto his shoulders, his patience with John's endless questions, the respect with which he addressed Emma's more adult concerns. For a man who claimed discomfort with children, he showed remarkable sensitivity to their needs. One evening, after the children had been tucked into bed, Violet found Jackson on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. She hesitated, not wanting to intrude on his solitude, but he sensed her presence and turned. Miss Hayes, he acknowledged with a nod. Children go down all right. Yes, though Sarah insisted on an extra story, Violet replied, stepping out onto the porch. The night air was cool but not unpleasant, scented with sage and pine from the surrounding hills. She's got you wrapped around her little finger already, Jackson observed, a smile in his voice. I'm afraid so, Violet admitted. She's rather irresistible. That she is. Jackson was quiet for a moment. They all are in their way, Emma with her seriousness, John with his curiosity. They're fortunate to have you, Violet said softly. Jackson shook his head. It's temporary. Once James returns, he'll take over again. He's their father, after all. Still, what you've done for them matters. They'll remember it always. Jackson shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. Been meaning to ask, how are you settling in? Is there anything you need, anything lacking? Violet considered the question seriously. Nothing important. The house is comfortable, the children are delightful, and I have meaningful work to do. It's more than I dared hope for a week ago. Jackson turned to face her fully, his expression curious in the moonlight. You never did say what brought you to Cottonwood Springs all alone. Violet hesitated. She'd successfully avoided this conversation thus far, but perhaps it was time for honesty. I was to be married, she said simply. The man I was engaged to disappeared with my family's savings. There was nothing left for me in St. Louis, no money, no prospects, only shame and pity. I came west because I had a distant cousin supposedly living in Cottonwood Springs. Only they weren't there, Jackson finished for her. No, they'd moved on months ago. Violet gave a small, rueful laugh. So there I sat in the wagon yard, contemplating my extremely limited options when a kind cowboy offered me employment. Jackson's gaze was steady, assessing. The man who took your family's money, you loved him? The question caught Violet off guard. Had she loved Gregory? She'd certainly thought so at the time, but now, with distance and perspective, she wasn't so certain. I believed I did, she answered honestly. Now I wonder if I was more in love with the idea of him, with the future I thought we would have together. Some men don't deserve the women who love them, Jackson said, his voice hard. Your former fiancé sounds like one of those. Perhaps, Violet acknowledged. Though in retrospect there were signs I chose to ignore. He was always chasing the next opportunity, the next venture that would make his fortune. She shook her head at her own naivety. I was blinded by pretty words and grand promises. And now, Jackson asked quietly, what do you want now, Miss Hayes? Violet looked out at the vast, star-scattered sky. Stability, she said finally, purpose, to be somewhere I'm needed where I can build something lasting. She smiled faintly. Not very romantic notions, I suppose. Seems to me those are the things that matter most, Jackson replied. The rest is just window dressing. They stood in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch, a distant coyote, the soft whicker of horses in the barn, the creak of the windmill creating a peaceful backdrop. It's getting late, Jackson finally said. And tomorrow's another busy day. Yes, of course, Violet agreed, suddenly aware of how improper it might seem for them to be alone together like this. Good night, Mr. Wade. As she turned to go inside, his voice stopped her. Jackson, he said. My friends call me Jackson. Violet looked back, catching the warmth in his eyes. Good night, Jackson, she amended softly. Good night, Violet, he replied, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected tremor through her. She hurried inside, her thoughts in confusion. She hadn't come west looking for romance, quite the opposite. Her experience with Gregory had left her wary and mistrustful. Yet there was something about Jackson Wade's straightforward manner, his quiet strength and unwavering sense of responsibility that touched her in ways she hadn't expected. But she was here as an employee, a temporary caretaker for his brother's children. Nothing more. She would do well to remember that, Violet told herself firmly as she climbed the stairs to her borrowed bedroom. Still, as she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind rustling through the cottonwoods outside her window, Violet couldn't help but recall the way Jackson had looked at her in the moonlight, as if truly seeing her for the first time. The days began to blur together, each one bringing Violet more deeply into the life of the Wade Ranch. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the cottonwoods along the stream. The children continued to thrive under her care, even Emma gradually lowering her guard to reveal a thoughtful, sensitive girl beneath her serious exterior. Jackson remained a somewhat enigmatic figure, present but often absorbed in ranch work that took him far afield for hours at a time. Yet Violet noticed small changes in his behavior, lingering at the breakfast table to discuss books with Emma, teaching John to whittle in the evenings, bringing Violet wildflowers he'd spotted while checking fence lines. One crisp Saturday morning, Jackson announced a special outing. Thought we might all ride up to the high meadow today, he said over breakfast. Show Miss Hayes some of the prettiest country around these parts. The children immediately erupted in excited chatter. Can we have a picnic? Sarah asked, bouncing in her seat. Will we see the wild horses? John wanted to know, is there time? Emma, ever practical, glanced at the clock. Jackson smiled at their enthusiasm. Yes to the picnic, maybe to the horses, and plenty of time if we get started soon. He turned to Violet. That is, if you're agreeable, Miss Hayes, it's about an hour's ride. I'd love to, Violet replied, caught up in their excitement despite a flutter of nervousness. Though I should warn you, my riding skills are rather rudimentary. Old Daisy's gentle as a lamb, Jackson assured her, and we'll take it slow. Within the hour, they were mounted and heading out, Jackson leading the way on his rangy bay gelding, the children on their ponies, and Violet somewhat tentatively perched on Daisy, a placid mare who seemed untroubled by her inexperienced rider. The land rose gradually as they rode, sagebrush giving way to scattered pine and juniper. Violet marveled at the vastness of the landscape, so different from the crowded streets of St. Louis. Here, a person could breathe, could see for miles in every direction. It's beautiful, she said, when they paused to let the horses drink from a small stream. Jackson, who had dismounted to help Sarah adjust her stirrups, glanced up. Different kind of beauty than what you're used to, I expect. Yes, but no less magnificent for being unfamiliar, Violet replied. Perhaps more so because it's unexpected. A smile touched his eyes. That's how I felt when I first came west, like I'd found something I never knew I was looking for. Uncle Jack was a Texas Ranger before he came here, John piped up proudly. He fought outlaws and Indians and everything. Jackson shook his head, looking embarrassed. It wasn't nearly as exciting as that, John. Mostly it was long, dusty days in the saddle looking for cattle thieves. But you were shot once, John persisted. Show Miss Hayes your scar. That's enough, John, Jackson said firmly, though without anger. Some stories aren't fit for mixed company. Violet found herself curious despite her better judgment. There was clearly more to Jackson Wade than the quiet rancher she'd come to know. They continued their journey, eventually reaching a high meadow ringed by pines, with a spectacular view of the surrounding territory. Distant mountains shimmered blue in the clear air, and a herd of pronghorn antelope grazed peacefully at the meadow's edge. "This is my favorite place in the whole world," Emma declared as they spread their picnic blanket beneath a large pine. "Mine too," Jackson agreed, helping Violet down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist, perhaps a moment longer than necessary, and Violet felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. The picnic was simple but delicious cold chicken, biscuits, apples, and cookies that Violet and Emma had baked the previous day. They ate with the hearty appetite that comes from fresh air and exercise, the children chattering happily about the sights they'd seen along the way. After they'd eaten, John and Sarah ran off to explore a nearby thicket, with strict instructions from Jackson to stay within calling distance. Emma settled against a tree trunk with a book she'd brought along, leaving Violet and Jackson sitting together on the blanket. "Thank you for suggesting this," Violet said, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "It's a perfect day." "Thought you might enjoy seeing more of the country," Jackson replied. "Gets lonely being stuck at the ranch day after day." "I haven't felt lonely," Violet said truthfully. "Quite the opposite, in fact. The ranch already feels more like home than anywhere I've been in years." Jackson glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Even with all the hard work and primitive conditions?" Violet laughed. "Perhaps because of them, in part. There's something satisfying about work that has tangible results: a clean house, a good meal, children learning their lessons." "Most women from your background wouldn't see it that way," Jackson observed. "I'm not most women," Violet replied simply. "No," he agreed, his voice softening. "You certainly are not Violet Hayes." The way he said her name sent that same curious tremor through her that she'd felt on the porch nights ago. Violet looked away, focusing on Emma to compose herself. "Tell me about your brother," she said, changing the subject. "The children speak of him often, but I feel I hardly know the man." Jackson followed her gaze to Emma. "James is a good man, hard-working, honest. He took Catherine's death hard. They were devoted to each other, but he's managing for the children's sake if nothing else. And he's due back soon, within the month, if all goes well with the cattle drive." Jackson pulled a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. "He'll be grateful for all you've done here." There was something in his tone that made Violet look at him sharply. "And you, will you stay on once he returns?" Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "I never stay anywhere long," he finally said. "It's not in my nature." "Emma mentioned you have wandering in your blood," Violet remarked. A small smile touched his lips. "That's James's way of explaining me to the children. Truth is, I've never found a reason compelling enough to put down roots." "What about the children? They adore you." "They have their father," Jackson replied. "They don't need an uncle underfoot." Violet wanted to argue but held her tongue. It wasn't her place to question his decisions, no matter how much the thought of his departure troubled her. The afternoon passed pleasantly, with Jackson showing Violet points of interest visible from their vantage point: distant ranches, the winding ribbon of the stage road, even the faint smudge on the horizon that was Cottonwood Springs. As the sun began its westward descent, they packed up their picnic things and rounded up the children for the return journey. The ride back was quieter, everyone pleasantly tired from the day's adventures. Even Sarah, usually bubbling with energy, drooped slightly in her saddle. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and gold. Jackson helped each child from their mount, then came to assist Violet. "Thank you for today," she said as his hands encircled her waist, lifting her effortlessly to the ground. "It was wonderful." "Glad you enjoyed it," he replied, his hands lingering at her waist again before he stepped back. "You're a natural on horseback, despite what you said." "Daisy deserves the credit," Violet demurred. "She's very patient with beginners." Jackson smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that transformed his weathered features. "Like rider, like horse, perhaps." Violet felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Perhaps, she acknowledged. That night, after the children were asleep, Violet sat in the rocking chair by her bedroom window, reflecting on the day. She couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward Jackson Wade. His quiet strength, his kindness toward his brother's children, the glimpses of humor and intelligence beneath his reserved exterior, all of these drew her to him in ways that both excited and frightened her. But she'd learned her lesson about rushing into matters of the heart. Besides, Jackson himself had made it clear he wasn't the settling type. When his brother returned, he would move on, just as he always did. And Violet, she would either stay on as the children's governess or find another position. Either way, whatever was developing between her and Jackson was destined to remain unresolved. With that sobering thought, Violet prepared for bed, determinedly pushing away the memory of Jackson's hands at her waist and the warmth in his blue eyes when he looked at her. The next 2 weeks brought a distinct change to the weather, with frosty mornings and increasingly chilly days. Jackson spent long hours ensuring the ranch was prepared for winter, repairing the barn roof, stockpiling firewood, and bringing in the last of the garden vegetables. Violet threw herself into domestic preparations with equal vigor, preserving food, mending winter clothing for the children, and knitting new scarves and mittens from yarn she found in a trunk. The rhythm of their days continued steadily, but with an undercurrent of anticipation as James Wade's return drew nearer. Then came the storm. It swept in from the north without warning, bringing biting wind and the first snow of the season. By mid-afternoon, the world outside the windows was a swirling white void, with visibility reduced to mere yards. Jackson returned from checking the livestock, stomping snow from his boots as he entered the kitchen where Violet was preparing supper. "Storm's worse than I expected," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Had to bring the new calves into the barn, don't think they'd survive the night otherwise." Violet handed him a cup of hot coffee. "Will it last long? Hard to say. Could blow itself out by morning, or it might settle in for days." He accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands red with cold despite his gloves. "Where are the children?" "In the front room. Emma's reading to the younger ones." Violet hesitated, then added, "They're worried about their father." Jackson nodded grimly. "They've reason to be. No man should be on the trail in weather like this. Is there a chance?" Violet couldn't bring herself to finish the question. "That he's caught in the storm?" "Yes," Jackson's voice was flat, "but James knows this country. If he couldn't make it home, he'd find shelter somewhere. He's got good men with him too." Violet touched his arm lightly. "The children need to hear that from you." Jackson looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. "You're right, I'll talk to them before supper." True to his word, Jackson gathered the children in the front room, explaining in simple terms that their father might be delayed by the storm but knew how to stay safe. His calm assurance seemed to ease their immediate fears, though Emma remained subdued throughout the evening. That night, the storm intensified. Wind howled around the eaves of the house, and snow accumulated in deep drifts against the walls. Violet lay awake, listening to the tempest and worrying about Jackson's brother and his men, somewhere out in that merciless white wilderness. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss Hayes." It was Emma's voice, small and frightened. Violet hurried to open the door. Emma stood there in her nightgown, her face pale in the dim light from Violet's lamp. "What is it, Emma? Are you all right?" "I had a dream about Pa," the girl whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He was lost in the snow and calling for help, but I couldn't find him." Violet's heart constricted. She opened her arms and Emma flew into them, her small body shaking with suppressed sobs. "It was just a dream," Violet soothed, stroking the girl's hair. "Your father is smart and experienced. He knows how to survive in bad weather." "But what if he doesn't come back?" Emma's voice was muffled against Violet's nightgown. "What if he dies like Mama did? Then we'll be all alone." "You'll never be alone," Violet promised fiercely. "No matter what happens, you have your Uncle Jackson, and—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "You have me for as long as you need me." Emma looked up, her tear-streaked face vulnerable in a way Violet had never seen before. "Do you promise?" "Even if Pa doesn't come back, I promise," Violet said solemnly, knowing she meant every word regardless of what the future might hold. She tucked Emma into bed beside her, and soon the girl's breathing deepened into sleep, secure in Violet's embrace. But Violet herself remained awake, troubled by her promise. She had no right to make such assurances. Her position here was temporary, dependent entirely on James Wade's approval when he returned. If he returned, a small voice whispered in her mind. Violet pushed the thought away, unwilling to contemplate such a tragedy. The storm raged for 2 more days, keeping them all confined to the house except for Jackson's necessary trips to care for the livestock. When it finally abated on the 3rd morning, the world outside was transformed a pristine white landscape under a flawlessly blue sky. Jackson set out immediately after breakfast to check for any damage to the outlying parts of the ranch and to look for strays that might have wandered in the blizzard. He returned mid-afternoon, his expression grim. "What is it?" Violet asked as soon as the children were out of earshot. "Found tracks on the north ridge," Jackson replied tersely. "Men and cattle heading east instead of south toward home. Your brother, can't be certain, but it makes sense. If they were caught in the open when the storm hit, they'd have sought the nearest shelter." He rubbed his jaw, stubble rasping against his palm. "There's a line shack about 10 miles east of here. Basic, but it would keep them alive. You're going after them," Violet said. It wasn't a question. Jackson nodded. "First light tomorrow. I can make it to the shack and back in a day if I push hard. The children will be worried. Tell them I'm checking fence lines. No need to frighten them unless there's cause." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm trusting you with this, Violet." The gravity in his voice made her shiver. "Of course. I'll keep them occupied and calm. I know you will." His hand came up as if to touch her face, then dropped away. "You've been a blessing to this family in ways I can't begin to express." Before Violet could respond, Sarah came running into the room, breaking the moment between them. But that night, as Violet prepared for bed, Jackson's words echoed in her mind. "A blessing to this family." The thought warmed her even as she worried about what the next day might bring. Jackson was gone before dawn, leaving Violet to explain his absence to the children over breakfast. As he'd suggested, she told them he was checking fences damaged in the storm, a task that might keep him away until evening. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Violet kept the children busy with lessons and indoor games, all the while watching the window for any sign of Jackson's return. By late afternoon, with the winter sun already lowering toward the horizon, even the children had grown restless and concerned. "Uncle Jack should be back by now," Emma said, looking up from her book. "It doesn't take this long to check fences." "The snow makes travel difficult," Violet replied, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm sure he'll be home soon." But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Violet's worry deepened into fear. She put the younger children to bed with assurances that their uncle would be there when they woke, but Emma was harder to convince. "Something's wrong," the girl insisted as Violet tucked her in. "I can feel it." "Your uncle is very capable," Violet said, smoothing Emma's hair. "He knows this land better than anyone. Try to rest now." But as she closed Emma's door, Violet's own doubts surfaced. What if Jackson had met with an accident? What if the tracks he'd followed hadn't been his brother's after all, leading him on a fruitless and dangerous journey? Unable to sleep, Violet kept vigil by the front window, a lamp burning low beside her. The hours crept by, marked only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Outside, the moon rose, casting blue-white light across the snow-covered yard. It was well past midnight when Violet spotted movement at the edge of the ranch yard, shadows against the snow, gradually resolving into the shapes of horses and men. Her heart leaped as she recognized Jackson's tall figure in the lead, followed by several other riders. Grabbing her shawl, Violet hurried outside, heedless of the cold. Jackson dismounted wearily, his face drawn with exhaustion but brightening at the sight of her. "You're safe," she breathed, relief making her dizzy. "And not alone," he replied, gesturing to the man dismounting beside him, a slightly shorter, broader version of himself, with the same blue eyes but a darker beard streaked with gray. "James," Violet guessed. The man stepped forward, removing his hat. "You must be Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a rougher version of Jackson's. "My brother's told me a great deal about you in the short time we've had to talk. Welcome home, Mr. Wade," Violet replied formally, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of her rushing out alone at night. The children will be overjoyed to see you in the morning. I can't wait to see them, James said, emotion roughening his voice further. It's been a long trail. Let's get everyone inside, Jackson interjected. It's too cold for conversation out here, and there are 4 more men who need warming up. The next hour was a flurry of activity as Violet heated food for the hungry travelers while they settled their horses and brought in their gear. The ranch hands would sleep in the bunkhouse, while James took the small bedroom off the kitchen that Jackson had been using. Once the men had eaten and dispersed to their beds, only Jackson and Violet remained in the kitchen. He looked utterly spent, dark circles under his eyes and several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. You found them, Violet said softly, pouring him another cup of coffee. Jackson nodded, warming his hands around the mug. Right where I thought they'd be, holed up in the line shack. Storm hit them hard about 15 miles from home. They lost a few head of cattle but managed to save most of the herd. Thank God you reached them safely, Violet said fervently. It was touch and go for a while. Trail was nearly invisible in places. He looked up at her, his eyes weary but warm. Kept thinking about getting back here to the children, to you. The simple admission sent a rush of warmth through Violet. I was so worried, she confessed, when you didn't return by nightfall. I'm sorry for that, Jackson said. Should have known it would take longer with the snow so deep. It doesn't matter now, Violet assured him. You're home safe and you've brought your brother back to his children. That's all that matters. Jackson studied her face in the lamplight. You're something special, Violet Hayes. Not many women would have handled all this with such grace. Before Violet could respond, the kitchen door opened and James Wade reappeared, looking marginally more refreshed after washing up. Children still sleeping? He asked quietly. Yes, Violet confirmed. They've been asking for you every day, but I thought it best to let them rest now. Morning will come soon enough. James nodded, gratitude in his tired eyes. Jackson tells me you've been a godsend to them, to this whole household. Violet felt her cheeks warm. I've simply done what needed doing, Mr. Wade. Your children are wonderful. It's been a privilege to care for them. James, please, he corrected. And I hope you'll stay on, at least for a while. The children will need time to adjust to me being back, and frankly, I could use the help getting the ranch in order after being gone so long. Of course, Violet agreed readily. I'd be happy to stay as long as I'm needed. Her eyes met Jackson's across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a question, perhaps, or a possibility neither was ready to voice. The reunion between James and his children the next morning was everything Violet could have hoped for: tears and laughter, hugs and exclamations, stories eagerly shared on both sides. She kept to the background, giving the family space to reconnect while ensuring breakfast was served and the household continued to function. Jackson, too, seemed content to observe rather than participate, watching his brother and nieces and nephew with quiet satisfaction. When their eyes occasionally met across the room, Violet felt that same wordless communication, a shared pleasure in the family's happiness, tempered by uncertainty about what would come next. Over the following days, a new routine gradually established itself. James took over much of the ranch work, freeing Jackson from some of his responsibilities. Violet continued to care for the children and manage the household, with James expressing frequent appreciation for her efforts. What surprised Violet most, however, was that Jackson showed no signs of preparing to leave. If anything, he seemed to be settling in more comfortably, undertaking long-term projects around the ranch that suggested he planned to stay for some time. A week after James's return, Violet found herself alone with Jackson in the barn, where she'd gone to collect eggs from the henhouse while he mended tack. Your brother seems to be adjusting well, she observed, setting her basket of eggs on a nearby stool. Jackson nodded, not looking up from the leather strap he was stitching. James is resilient, always has been. The children are thriving with him home, Violet continued, especially Emma. She seems lighter somehow. She needed her father, Jackson agreed. They all did. Violet hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind for days. When will you leave? Now Jackson did look up, surprise evident in his expression. Leave? You said it wasn't in your nature to stay in one place, Violet reminded him, that you had wandering in your blood. A slow smile spread across Jackson's face. Did I say that? Seems I might have been mistaken. Violet's heart quickened. What do you mean? Jackson set aside his work and stood, crossing to where she stood by the henhouse door. "I've been thinking, Violet Hayes, about roots and wandering and what makes a man choose one over the other." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Violet asked, hardly daring to breathe as he stopped before her. "That sometimes a man wanders because he hasn't found what he's looking for," Jackson said simply. "And sometimes he stops wandering for the same reason." He took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. "I never expected to find you sitting in that wagon yard, looking lost and determined all at once. Never expected you'd turn this place into a real home in just a few weeks. Never expected." He paused, his eyes searching hers, to feel this way about anyone. "Jackson," Violet whispered, her voice catching on his name. "I know it's soon," he continued quickly. "Too soon, maybe, after what you've been through, and I'm not a wealthy man, not educated like you are. All I have is this land, a share in the ranch, and a promise that I'll do right by you every day for the rest of our lives if you'll have me." Violet stared at him, her mind whirling. Was he proposing? Here, in a barn that smelled of hay and horses, with her holding a basket of eggs. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she managed finally. Jackson's grip on her hands tightened slightly. "I am, not very romantically, I'm afraid, but with all my heart." "But you barely know me," Violet protested weakly, even as joy began to bubble up inside her. "I know enough," Jackson replied steadily. "I know you're kind and patient and stronger than you realize. I know the children adore you and my brother respects you. I know that when you smile, the whole room seems brighter. And I know that the thought of you leaving makes me feel hollow inside." Tears welled in Violet's eyes at the simple honesty of his words. No flowery declarations or grand promises, just the plain truth of his feelings, offered without artifice. "What about my past?" she asked, needing to be certain. "The broken engagement, my family's situation." "The past is past," Jackson said firmly. "We've all got things behind us we'd rather forget. What matters is who we are now and what we build together going forward." Violet searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his blue eyes. This was no Gregory with his charm and empty promises. This was a man who spoke plainly and meant what he said, who had proven his character through actions rather than words. "Yes," she said finally, her voice strong despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes, Jackson Wade, I will marry you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, his kiss both tender and fiercely possessive. Violet responded with equal fervor, her heart soaring with a happiness she'd never thought to find again, especially not in this remote corner of the frontier. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted. "Didn't exactly plan this speech ahead of time." "I don't need a ring," Violet assured him. "Just you and this home we're building together." "You'll have both," Jackson promised, kissing her again more gently, "and anything else I can give you." "What will the children think?" Violet wondered, suddenly concerned. "And your brother, it's his home too." "The children will be overjoyed," Jackson predicted confidently. "They already love you. And James, well, James has been nudging me in this direction since the day he got back. Said he'd never seen me look at anyone the way I look at you." Warmth bloomed in Violet's chest. "And how is that?" "Like you're the answer to a question I've been asking my whole life," Jackson replied simply. Before Violet could respond to this extraordinary statement, the barn door swung open and little Sarah burst in. "Miss Violet, Uncle Jack, Papa says come quick, there's a surprise." They followed the excited child back to the house, hand in hand, to find James and the older children gathered around a large package on the kitchen table. "What's this?" Jackson asked, his arms settling comfortably around Violet's waist. James grinned, looking more relaxed and happy than Violet had yet seen him. "Neighbor rode over with it, came on yesterday's stage. It's addressed to Miss Hayes." Startled, Violet approached the package. "For me, but who would send me anything here?" "Only one way to find out," Jackson encouraged, squeezing her shoulder. With everyone watching expectantly, Violet untied the string and unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a wooden box, finely crafted with brass hinges. Atop it lay a letter addressed in a familiar hand that made Violet gasp. "It's from my mother," she said, astonished. She quickly opened the letter, reading silently while the family waited with barely contained curiosity. "What does it say?" Emma finally asked when Violet lowered the letter, tears once again filling her eyes. "My mother writes that she's been trying to locate me since I left St. Louis," Violet explained, her voice unsteady. "My father. He passed away suddenly last month." "I'm so sorry," Jackson said softly, his hand warm on her back. Violet nodded acknowledgement but continued. "In his final days, he confessed that he'd been too harsh in sending me away. He asked my mother to find me, to tell me he was sorry, and to give me this." She gestured to the box. "What's in it?" John asked, unable to contain himself any longer. With trembling fingers, Violet lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on velvet, were several pieces of fine jewelry, her grandmother's pearls, her mother's cameo, and a small pouch that, when opened, revealed a collection of gold coins. "My inheritance," Violet whispered. "Father set it aside for me years ago, before his business troubles. Mother writes that he wanted to ensure I would be provided for no matter what." "That's wonderful news," James said warmly. "There's more," Violet continued, still reading. "Mother asks me to return to St. Louis, says there's a place for me at home now that father is gone." She looked up at Jackson, uncertain how to proceed in light of what had just transpired between them, but Jackson's expression remained steady, his eyes meeting hers without a trace of doubt. "Do you want to go back?" he asked simply. Violet looked around the kitchen at the children watching her with wide, concerned eyes, at James's kind, interested face, and finally back to Jackson, whose gaze held everything she'd come to cherish in this unexpected new life. "No," she said firmly, setting the letter aside. "My place is here now, with all of you." Her eyes lingered on Jackson. "With you," the relief on his face was palpable. "You're sure St. Louis has a lot more to offer than we do out here." "It has buildings and shops and theaters," Violet acknowledged, "but it doesn't have this family. It doesn't have a home where I truly belong." She took his hand, no longer concerned about propriety or appearances. "It doesn't have you." Jackson's smile was slow and sweet. "Then I guess we have an announcement of our own to make," he said, glancing at his brother. James's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Miss Hayes has agreed to become Mrs. Wade," Jackson stated, pride evident in his voice. "If that meets with everyone's approval." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a chorus of reactions: Sarah's squeal of delight, John's whoop of excitement, Emma's wide-eyed "really?" and James's hearty laugh. "About time you settled down, little brother," James said, coming forward to clap Jackson on the shoulder. "And you couldn't have chosen better." He turned to Violet, his expression sincere. "Welcome to the family, officially." "Does this mean you'll be our aunt?" John asked eagerly. "Yes, it does," Violet confirmed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Sarah launched herself at Violet, wrapping small arms around her waist. "I knew you'd stay forever. I asked God for it every night." Even Emma seemed pleased, though in her more reserved way. "Will you still teach us our lessons?" she asked practically. "Of course," Violet assured her. "Nothing important will change. I'll just be family instead of just your teacher." "Everything important already changed the day Jackson found you in that wagon yard," James observed wisely. "The rest is just making it official." Jackson's arm tightened around Violet's waist. "Smartest thing I ever did," he agreed, offering my hand to the pretty lady sitting all alone with her trunk. "And a home," Violet added softly, "just for him. You offered me a home." "That I did," Jackson acknowledged, his eyes warm with promise. "And now it truly will be yours, for as long as we both shall live." They were married 3 weeks later in the parlor of the ranch house, with Reverend Thompson riding out from Cottonwood Springs to perform the ceremony. Violet wore a new dress of deep blue silk, a gift from her mother, who had written again with her blessing for the marriage, but explained that poor health prevented her from traveling to attend. The house was decorated with pine boughs and the last of the fall flowers, and Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring ranch had baked a magnificent 3-tier cake. The children were scrubbed to within an inch of their lives, with Emma proudly serving as Violet's attendant, wearing a new dress that matched the bride's in color if not in style. As they exchanged their vows before the fireplace, Violet marveled at the twists and turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had sat alone and despairing in a strange town, believing her life effectively over. Now she stood hand in hand with a man she had come to love deeply, surrounded by a family that had welcomed her as one of their own. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thompson declared with satisfaction. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Wade." Jackson needed no further invitation. His kiss was gentle but thorough, prompting cheers from the small gathering of guests and a theatrical groan from John that made everyone laugh. The celebration continued well into the evening, with neighbors from surrounding ranches joining in the festivities. There was music and dancing, storytelling and toasts, and through it all, Jackson never strayed far from Violet's side, his pride in his new wife evident to all who saw them together. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Violet stood with Jackson on the porch of what was now truly their home. The winter air was crisp and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "Happy, Mrs. Wade?" Jackson asked, his arms encircling her from behind as they gazed out at the moonlit landscape. "Beyond words," Violet replied truthfully, leaning back against his solid strength. "I never imagined finding such joy here in a place so different from everything I knew." "I never imagined finding you," Jackson admitted, his breath warm against her hair. "Wasn't even looking, if I'm honest, but there you were, sitting so straight and proud despite everything, and something in me just knew." "Knew what?" Violet asked, turning in his arms to see his face. "That you were the reason I'd never settled anywhere before," Jackson said simply. "I was waiting for you without even knowing it." Violet reached up to touch his face, the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "I think perhaps I was waiting for you too." "For this place, this life," Jackson captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "It won't always be easy," he warned. "Ranch life is hard and the winters are long. There'll be lean years and tough times." "I know," Violet said serenely, "but we'll face them together, all of us." Jackson smiled, the moonlight catching the affection in his eyes. "Together," he agreed, bending to kiss her again, this time with a thoroughness that spoke of the private hours awaiting them. As she melted into her husband's embrace, Violet sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had left her alone and bereft in Cottonwood Springs that September day. For the cowboy who had found her sitting quietly in the wagon yard, offered his hand and a home to call her own. For the unexpected journey that had led her not to the future she'd once planned, but to one infinitely more precious and true. Here, in this remote corner of the New Mexico territory, with a man who loved her honestly and a family who needed her, Violet Hayes Wade had found her true beginning. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the ranch yard as Violet shaded her eyes, watching the approaching riders with a smile of anticipation. Jackson and James had been gone for nearly a week, driving cattle to the railhead at Santa Fe, and their return was cause for celebration. "Mama, they're coming." 4-year-old Thomas, the spitting image of his father with the same wheat blonde hair and sky-blue eyes, tugged excitedly at her skirt. Beside him, 2-year-old Rose clutched her rag doll, thumb firmly in mouth as she peered out from behind her mother's skirts. "I see them, sweetheart," Violet assured her son, adjusting her hat to better block the glare. Her free hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their third child was just beginning to make its presence known. The front door of the house banged open as Emma, now 13 and blossoming into a lovely young woman, emerged with Sarah and John close behind. At 12, John was shooting up like a weed, already talking about joining the cattle drives next year, much to Violet's dismay. Sarah, at 9, retained her impish nature but had developed a surprising talent for music, her clear voice often filling the house with song. "Do you think Pa brought the fabric he promised?" Emma asked, coming to stand beside Violet. She had her heart set on a new dress for the upcoming harvest dance in town. "I'm sure he did," Violet replied, smiling at her niece who had become so much like a daughter these past years. "Your father never forgets a promise." The riders drew closer, dust rising from the horses' hooves in the dry summer air. Jackson rode in the lead, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him, James sat easily in the saddle, having finally lost the grief-stricken pallor that had marked him when Violet first arrived at the ranch. As soon as they entered the yard, Thomas broke free from Violet's grasp and raced toward his father, arms outstretched and voice raised in gleeful welcome. Jackson swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, sweeping his son up into a bear hug that made the boy shriek with laughter. "There's my boy," Jackson exclaimed, tossing Thomas into the air. "Have you been taking care of your mama and sister while I was gone?" "Yes, sir," Thomas affirmed proudly. "I helped with the chickens and everything." Jackson carried his son back to where Violet waited, his eyes drinking in the sight of his wife and daughter. "And how are my best girls?" he asked, bending to kiss Violet's cheek while balancing Thomas on his hip. "Missing you," Violet replied simply, the familiar warmth spreading through her at his touch. "And the little one?" Jackson asked more quietly, his free hand moving to cover hers on her belly. "Growing stronger every day," Violet assured him. "Dr. Miller says everything looks perfect." Jackson's smile deepened, the lines around his eyes crinkling with happiness. After 5 years of marriage, he still looked at her as if she were the greatest treasure he'd ever found. James joined them, having distributed the promised gifts to his own children: fabric for Emma, a small knife for John, approved in advance by Violet over Jackson's mild objections, and a carved wooden flute for Sarah that had her immediately attempting to play a tune. Successful trip. Violet asked as they all moved toward the house, where a welcome home feast awaited. "Very," James confirmed. "Got top dollar for the herd, and Jackson talked the buyer into contracting for next year's drive as well." "My husband has always been persuasive," Violet observed with a sidelong smile at Jackson. "Only when it matters," he replied, shifting Thomas to his shoulders to free a hand for little Rose, who had finally overcome her shyness to demand her father's attention. Inside, the house was cool and fragrant with the scent of fresh bread and the apple pie Violet had baked that morning. 5 years of improvements had transformed the once plain dwelling into a comfortable, welcoming home. New curtains graced the windows, the floors gleamed with polish, and shelves of books lined one wall of the front room, evidence of Violet's ongoing commitment to education for all the children. As they settled around the large table for the meal, Violet took a moment to absorb the scene: Jackson at one end, James at the other, the children between them chattering excitedly about the events of the past week. Her family, not by birth but by choice and circumstance and love. Later, after the children were in bed, and James had retired to his small house nearby, built 3 years ago when the growing family needed more space, Violet and Jackson sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I was thinking," Jackson said, his arm comfortable around her shoulders, "that we might take a trip to St. Louis next spring after the baby comes. It's been too long since you've seen your mother." Violet looked up at him in surprise. "Really, but the spring roundup." "James and the boys can handle it," Jackson said confidently. "And you said yourself that your mother's health is failing. It would be good for her to meet her grandchildren before." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Tears pricked at Violet's eyes, not just at the thought of her mother, but at this further evidence of her husband's thoughtfulness. "I would love that," she said softly. "Thank you." Jackson kissed her temple. "No need for thanks, love. It's what family does." Violet settled more comfortably against him, her head on his shoulder as the swing rocked gently. "Do you ever wonder," she asked after a moment, "what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to speak to me that day in the wagon yard?" Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his hand absently stroking her arm. "Sometimes," he admitted, "and every time I thank God that I did." "As do I," Violet murmured, turning her face up for his kiss. As their lips met in the gentle darkness of the New Mexico night, Violet reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment. From despair to joy, from isolation to belonging, from a woman abandoned to one cherished beyond measure. All because a cowboy had found her sitting quietly in a wagon yard, offered his hand and a home to call her own.